Hi, and welcome back to the Mom Mentality Show. I'm Chris Lucian, and my co-host is Austin Chadwick. And today we are here with James Herr, and we're talking about game jams, the associated Discord, and how mobbing fits into it all. But maybe, James, you can give us a quick intro, and then we can jump into the conversation.
Sure, you bet. I'm a full stack engineer right now. I've been doing so for about 8 years. Been deeply passionate about collaboration and game development since I was an early teen. So I actually started with a program called RPG Toolkit, which is a lot like RPG Maker. Very old, very Windows XP, but it was cool. Had an awesome community. So I've stayed in touch with those guys, and they're all pretty friendly and still awesome to talk to. Since then, I've published games on Steam. I've done half a dozen game jams. Currently working on some side efforts with Twitch through game jams and learning efforts. But outside of that, actually, I am very busy as well with the three kids. I got a 10, 6, and 3-year-old, and two cats, two dogs. So they definitely keep me distracted. So it's a good time.
Nice, nice. Yeah, I might be able to rival you with four kids, two dogs, birds, and then to
Birds,
scare the
nice,
audience, rats. We have rats, so
nice.
that's out of the bag now.
Sounds like
That's
a
awesome.
whole ecosystem.
Yes,
Uh,
yes.
all right, well, yeah, with this topic of, I guess, game jams, we can kind of start there and just meander if you like.
Yeah, are you guys familiar with game jams at all? Kind of what that means, and if not, I
I'm
can.
sure that there are some in our audience that are not familiar. So,
Sure. Yeah, so basically, game jams, I participate in them through itch.io. You get some time between 2 days, a week, or a month to try to create a game, and then you submit it. It gets voted on. Sometimes you win prizes, sometimes you don't, but they're usually ranked. So, um, like I said, I've done about half a dozen of those. I think those are pretty cool. I've done Unity. I've been recently using Godot to make these. Um,
and then these are essentially jams to make a video game as an end product, right?
Correct.
And yeah, just for our audience, Unity is a proprietary engine with like a free entry base, and Godot is the probably the largest growing open source comparative thing. So think like Linux for making video games, maybe. Um, so yeah, so that's really cool. And uh, so in these game jams are, I guess this being a like mob programming podcast. Are you doing these as mobs or pairs, or is this something merging some other way?
So how it started out through the Discord. The I would say, hey, I'm in a jam. Like someone, let's team up. Let's do this together. Often it was hard to get people to get involved and stay involved. So the first game we pushed out, we did pretty good at that, but I wanted to try to fix that particular issue, right? So the next time we did more swarming, so we were just on the call together, and it was still largely just me operating, but it was kind of a step in the right direction. And I think through our third one, I think Goobus is what we called it. It's a little head that floats around and shoots bullets. It's pretty cool. With that one, it was our introduction to mobbing. So I got as soon as I learned about it at work, I was like, let's do this on for game jams, and immediately like everyone was participating, everyone was contributing. They wanted to, maybe they would return for second sessions. Like it was immediately beneficial.
Nice.
Yeah. Did you have like programmers and artists, or was it just programmers working with existing art, that sort of thing? Because I think that's a question that I think I hear a lot is like cross-disciplinary mobbing.
That's a great question. In our case, we didn't have any artists or musicians that were actively participating in those. However, they were not always programmers, so sometimes people were new to that, so they didn't have any skill set necessary for that as far as that goes. So that was kind of a unique experience, I guess.
Being able to jump into a game jam and work on games, even though you've never seen the tooling, programming, or done any of it, right?
Right.
Yeah. So how did that feel? Like, what was successful? What was not successful? How was that?
Oh, that was a while ago, so it's pressing my memory a little bit. But uh, I guess not for the new people, but for everyone else that participated, because like the key takeaway, I guess, was is that everyone was participating and contributing. I guess. No, I guess I thought it went well.
Nice, nice, awesome. And uh, I've done a little, very tiny fraction amount of game development. But I will push Chris into the center of the dance circle here. He is quite the game developer,
Yeah.
and my junction into it actually was fairly correlated at the same time with mobbing. So I did zero game development. I wanted to take the course in college, but it wasn't available or it didn't line up with my schedule. But then my kids were taking coding stuff in school, and they told me they wanted to make a video game about our birds, and so we made one using Unity, and our game got a million times better when Chris and other experienced people joined them up. So, um, yeah, it was very hacky before, and then it was kind of like, oh wow, the game actually, like keeps track of score, and there's power ups, and all this kinds of stuff, and so yeah, and I could definitely relate to what you're saying, where even with kids, everyone learns and contributes. And I think it's kind of funny with kids, it's almost like they're more free-spirited. So some of my kids didn't really care to code, but they like testing, playing the game.
Right. Yep.
So they were just like, "Have you done the next build yet? We want to try the new thing, and we'll just keep testing the old version until you're done." And then some other kids were more interested in actually making the game. So
Yeah, I definitely have a little squad of testers as well. My daughter still has to play a couple of them, which is cool. I they've actually helped me with some of the audio to get them to participate how I can. So like, we did a game called Poke the Bear where it was the theme was pay the price. So we did this strategy for brainstorming, which was cool. Maybe I'll touch on it later. But we came up with Poke the Bear. So you poke the bear with a stick until you pay the price, right? So we had him, growl into the mic, and then I used Audacity to lower the pitch, make it real deep. So he loved like actually being in the game and hearing it back.
Yeah, and I guess it's important context for our listeners that aren't familiar with game development. In these game jams, a lot of times there are themes. Sometimes they're randomized. Sometimes they're voted on by the community, and everybody builds their game around that theme. And so, the art, the mechanics that are programmed in, all of the design ends up following that theme in some way, but they create wildly different outputs, which is what makes it fun. So I've done Ludum Dare a number of times, the 2-day compo, and they've been it's been a lot of fun to kind of see what comes out of that. I imagine that being in a mob, uh, I think that very few game developers well, so I think that, yeah, I think very few game developers don't like games, but I know that a lot of like industry programmers may not like the thing that they're doing or they're programming for, right? So it's like, somebody working in medical might not actually be interested in medical, but they're writing code for medical. But I think that most game programmers are interested in video games, right? Like it's probably an association you can make. So I imagine that the mobbing discussion around product ownership would be very different in the game design space because essentially everybody on the team would more or less be a like customer expert in some way, and therefore product ownership can be easily mobbed among the programmers. Have you seen that sort of thing, like a shared ownership of the direction of the game, or has it
Yeah.
been different?
So through the game jams, those are, I guess, short little bursts. So when we're binging them like that, not so much there, unless it's just like ideas in the moment. So we all kind of share ownership in that way, I guess. But through my latest one that we're doing on Twitch, which is the platformer that I'm making for a local company here. Through that, we fish for ideas on Twitch itself. So um,
nice.
yeah, so like let's say we're trying to think of ideas for the boss fight, right? So we go into Microsoft Paint, we're all doodling like what should he do, what kind of attack should it be? So we come up with like a wave attack for the boss. Like maybe he's throwing briefcases at the player at the same time. Um, yeah,
Nice.
so I mean, it's there's definitely some shared ownership there. So it is definitely different than what we'd see at work. Did I fully answer that?
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Okay.
I'm
Yeah,
just curious about like, yeah, the level of input because when mobbing with a number of developers, often um, the domain expert might even be outside of the mob coming in to like talk about why you're doing what you're doing.
Yeah.
And I imagine in a mob of game developers, it might be both good and bad, right? You might argue more about the direction of the game because you're all very passionate in different directions. But you also might be much more attuned with like what the visceral reaction is to whatever you do build. So,
Yeah, and I kind of need that too. Otherwise, like all of my games would probably be the same format, the same genre, right? So like
right.
I'm too narrow sighted with what and how I want to make it. So it gives me a different way to learn. Someone will throw an idea out there, and I'm like, I would have never thought of that on my own, right? Like that's
Yeah.
awesome. So we'll implement it that way.
Well, so you talked a little bit about getting ideas from Twitch. So for those who don't know, Twitch is a streaming service that's primarily focused around video games, but people do development as well. But mostly people stream them playing games and talking over it. Um, I noticed that you were doing streams. I've joined your streams before and kind of contributed in the chat. So you're not only mobbing with people there on the stream, but you're also interacting with the chat. So what's that like?
That's been interesting. So we're still trying to find, and I suspect we'll always be experimenting and adapting, but we're still trying to find like the perfect flavor of how to interact with chat. So at the moment it was, so we have the timer, right, where we rotate. So it was like maybe when someone's turn, we'll glance at the chat quick, just make sure that we're paying attention to it. Um, which has been nice. Get ideas or like, hey, your audio's not working. Just any sort of feedback from the chat has been nice. But we've talked about how to better include chat because that's I think a good experience for a lot of people. So our next experiment is going to be we're going to try to have them as a dedicated member on the rotation. So it'll be like me, Chris, and then maybe the third person will just say chat, right? And
Yeah,
they won't be able to drive, right? But they can navigate that turn possibly. So I really want to try that and see how that turns out.
good idea.
This my brain fires in several different directions here, but it's funny because I coached a baseball team of middle schoolers like 11 and 12, and I think I noticed the first time last spring is we're on the field in a physical space. There's no computers, and they're like talking out loud or talking to each other, and they'll make references to the chat, like, "Oh, chat, what did you think of that hit?" Or and they're like, "What?" I'm like, "What are they talking about?" Oh, because they're talking like a Twitch streamer, even though we're like in person at a baseball game. So I just thought it was hilarious. That kind of lingo has like baked itself into just like culture in general, like interacting with the chat while you're doing something.
Right.
And you're right. I think it gives a cool level of feedback and ideas. And I've seen Chris do that to mobs before at work, right, Chris? Where you're like, there's a team mobbing, and then all of a sudden, maybe Chris is watching or he saw what we were doing earlier, and then here comes an idea from Chris via the chat. Um,
Yeah,
have you
don't
ever
interrupt the
seen it?
flow.
Yeah, yeah. Have you ever seen something like that at work where there's like a mob, but then they're also supplemented by some other chat system?
Yeah, definitely. And that actually made me think of because there's been lots of talks of getting the UX folk involved in the mob in some capacity. So I wonder if we could have them participate in that same kind of style, right? Like have them as a dedicated rotation. Maybe they just ask questions, give feedback, or whether we just look at the chat during that moment, right?
Yeah,
But we haven't done it yet, but it's very much talked about frequently.
gotcha.
Kind of on the topic of like Twitch and interactions, a couple ways I think that you could drive engagement. So Twitch has an API, and I always thought about this, like if I was streaming game development, like what would I do? And so what you could do is you could also have it so that people in the chat could mess with your testing, by connecting the chat to the API and then allowing them to spawn things when you jump in and things like that. So it would be a little bit distracting, but it would provide some back and forth between the chat, or even populating the chat within the UI in Unity is also something that you could potentially do, even in edit mode. So
Yeah, that is really cool. Something to consider. So,
yeah,
when I like to do brainstorming for that kind of stuff, or even just working on it, I'll usually hop on the Discord and offer people to come do it with me. So like, I don't want to just make something by my own. I want to have
right.
people learn with me at the same time. So whether it's that, or I really want to get like DeepSeek maybe tied up to the game in some capacity. Maybe it's a NPC, or I don't know. I saw a video last week, so I've been inspired to try to do something like that.
Yeah, very
Yeah, yeah,
That's a
yeah.
great idea.
Yeah, and this kind of raises kind of a meta topic that I think probably will span game dev and maybe work dev. Is and I think it probably has some correlation with people's certain mobbing styles. So I've seen certain mobs where kind of the asynchronous nature of stuff happening outside the driver navigator discussion flow and that kind of like extra layer of chaos, like the mob loves or the people in the mob love it. I've also seen mobs where there is some strong hate for anything distracting away from kind of the focus on the driver navigator discussion happening there. You know what I mean, kind of thing. What's been your experiences? Maybe starting with game dev or
Just to
and
clarify. Oh, sorry.
yeah.
What do you mean by distractions there?
Yeah, so for example, like yeah, just be really concrete. Let's say I'm a navigator who's more doesn't want distractions. So I'm telling, all right, Chris, go to line 10, let's make a new function and in this function, and then I look over and I see a chat message, and then my navigation's broken. And then I forgot what I was saying, and then I'm like reading the chat, and then I'm like, oh, I don't want to respond to that right now, and then I come back to my navigation and I'm confused. Someone who's more distracted by, you know, stuff firing all over the place, versus maybe others who are more embracing the chaos. Have you ever seen one or the other, or maybe only one side of that?
I'm definitely very prone to distractions for sure.
Uh-huh.
Um,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess I don't know too specifically. One thing I like to do is I just kind of talk out loud, like
Hmm.
I'm like keeping it high level here, and just having that like constant out loud thought kind of just keeps me focused. So don't see a lot of distractions from other people as far as like things from the chat or too much of that in my world.
Oh, good. Good, 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 good.
we
Nice.
I, I know there's a bunch of other roles that people could potentially play, if you're doing like the
Mm.
the RPG version that you guys have talked about previously.
Mm.
I was watching a few of the other videos. We typically, for mine, because everyone's still pretty new to mobbing, I usually just do the two roles, and I think the other ones kind of come out naturally over time. Like
Right.
I'm on my own, just going to become a researcher in the background, right? Or like maybe I'll hit up ChatGPT while you guys are discussing, and it seems like those kind of form themselves. But I suspect as a team matures, like there'd be more opportunity to play around with some of those RPG roles. I think that would be fun.
Yeah, and sometimes when you have an experienced mobber in the group, the game's not necessary, but I think that
Right.
what I see is that the RPG ends up dispelling the misconceptions of mobbing. Like it's not the driver and the watchers, right? And so that comment I think I've heard before. And so it's like, well, no, actually, there's quite a lot that you can be doing in a third or fourth person, as a third or fourth person on a team. Um, but yeah, so you mentioned the Discord and put an emphasis on that. So like, what's special about the Discord? How did it come to be? What was the yeah,
I, how it came to be, I guess, it's just friends coming together and learning, and I've been doing this effort to try to like just be in there more frequently, and just whatever I'm doing, we're all kind of sharing the same space. So maybe we're two working on separate different things, we ask each other questions, or we're doing it collaboratively, and maybe we're setting up some sort of tool or website at the moment. So it's a just a game space, somewhere to learn. So we have all sorts of professionals in there that are really thirsty to learn, which is nice. And then I've actually opened it up recently to I'm gonna be hosting my own game jam. So I'll be actually receiving games and judging them on Twitch. So it's been cool to see this flood of people come in, just of all different skill sets, whether it's UX people, sound, all over the place. So it's been really cool seeing the member count kind of go up slowly.
Nice, nice, nice. Oh, that's great. Um, Rocking. Yeah. And probably coming back to game jam stuff and mobbing, but maybe to help build a little more context for me, what was your journey learning to mob or first encountering mobbing? I'm guessing it was at work, and then what was that journey like? And then probably we'll come back to
Yeah.
the game
So
side of it. Yeah.
at previous roles, I was a advocate and leader for swarming. That was all I knew at the time. So I would
Yes.
introduce swarming sessions, get people talking and in the same space and collaborating on their work. So I was really proud of that, and it was part of my resume getting into this place. And when I got to here, they're like, "Well, this is mobbing. Let me show you this." And I was like, "This fixes everything that was wrong with swarming, right? Because people are quiet, they're not talking. Usually it's just one person sharing their screen. Like there's a lot of anti patterns that come out of swarming, right? So uh, yeah, so through my current job, was introduced to mobbing and immediately applied it outside of work. Like just the benefits were so clear. I can't help but gush about it.
Nice. But how long have you been mobbing at work?
Oh, it's probably been about 2 years now, a little over two.
Nice. Very good. Yeah. And how long did it take before mobbing translated into game development for you?
Well, we were already swarming, so it was like probably that week. I had the idea like pretty much immediately.
Nice. Yeah, yeah, it's just like the natural next step, I suppose, right? Yeah, because if you're already swarming, you're like so close anyways, right?
Right. I already have all these issues in the back of my mind, like how can I fix these? And then like presented with like the perfect solution. I was like, oh,
Yeah,
there you
yeah,
go.
yeah, yeah. Nice, nice. Yeah, it's interesting to me that I don't know your all's experiences, but um at least in the kind of the corporate world, especially at previous places I've been at, swarming is okay. Like people aren't objected to it. But as soon as you say something like mobbing, it's kind of like, nope, absolutely not. Like you've just crossed the line that I do not want to go over, or you just created a line I don't want to go over. And so I really kind of like that flow you talked about, where you're like, you're swarming, you're experiencing the problems of swarming, and then it's kind of like, but people like swarming, right? And then you're like, oh, just this slight modification, and now we're mobbing, and it's almost like less of a whiplash introduction into mobbing, maybe.
Yeah. It's interesting you say that because like at work, there's definitely resistance to doing it, whether it's like stress or they view it as stressful, whatever the case. And on the game side, I get none of that, right? Everyone's real thirsty to learn, and I want to de-silo myself, having all the Godot knowledge. So like it's just win-win over there. So we at work, it's a constant battle of like how can we get buy-in, right? Like how can we get people bought into the process, even if they have these preconceived issues with it or
Mm.
concerns, right? So we've been toying with ideas of how to fix that, whether it's little workshops like, hey, let's make a little game together, right? And just doing that at work, because we have a work theme platformer right now that we've been demoing a little bit.
Mm.
um Otherwise, we thought maybe we'll do we have like mini projects that we do, and we'll have a lot of the experienced mobbers on those, and maybe we'll cycle in a new member every story or every sprint, and just hopefully just crank out people bought in.
Yeah, exposure. I think exposure is a key thing, and looking at it from the outside is very different than experiencing it in kind of a flow state. And so I see a lot of adoption grow very quickly when the visit happens, but before the visit happens, there's a lot of skepticism and assumptions being made, right? So often it's just extending the branch to, get people going on it is really important.
I think tooling also kind of plays a big part in that, because if you're doing the timer right, like it's hard to, you almost don't even realize it's there or it exists. Like it just comes up, you hit continue, it
Mhm.
just the flow moves on. What do you guys have preferred software that you use?
Yeah, well, I think that most of our teams use the Mobster timer, right? But there are a few of them out there. I've written a .NET and a Python timer a long, long time ago. So when we were first, so be about 13 years ago now, I started the .NET timer. And then and so that was kind of the first iteration of that software in general. Dylan Kearns had made the Mobster timer, which was kind of built on Electron and much more full and Elm and much more full featured. But there's a variety of them out there, especially like command line timers, all the way to other things. Um, so yeah, but I think Mobster, the one that came from Dylan Kearns is probably the most popular out there at the moment. And yeah.
I suspect that's the one I'm using as well. As far as the screen sharing tool, we use Pop almost exclusively, but some teams use Mob SH as a kind of an in between.
What do you use? I missed the name.
Pop and some teams use
Pop.
Mob SH. So
Okay,
it's like
gotcha.
I don't even know if I could describe it. I
So,
haven't used it yet.
so yeah, your style of mobbing is transferring the code from computer to computer when you're working together, right? Rather than all logging into the same computer and working on the same computer, right?
Yes.
Um, and so, yeah, and that's like a good distinction too, is that I think there are, you know, when people are saying they're mobbing, actually, they could be mobbing in two very different ways. Like in our environment, we all have servers and we use either AnyDesk or TeamViewer, and we all are on the same server with the same tooling. If somebody doesn't know a shortcut in that tooling and somebody else does, they can still say, "Oh, by the way, if you do this, it'll work." And so that is a fundamentally different experience. And we've our teams have tried both ways and had preferred this way, but you have to have a really good connection at the endpoint of that server.
Yeah. No, I didn't even realize that
Yeah.
was on the table.
Yeah.
That's really cool.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. And we'll put a link in the show notes, 2 episodes where Chris and I talked more about that. But the quick soundbite for me is that I came from in-person mobbing only, and so the same remote computer style was very seamless, like to in-person mobbing. And I have tried the Git handover, and it is cool, but done very little of it. But yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, did you have any other questions for us? I had more questions for you, but if you have questions for us, shoot.
I do have a few, but nothing. I think they'll come up kind of naturally on their own.
Nice. Okay, cool. One thing I noticed about everything you've talked about so far is, whether you're swarming at work, swarming to mobbing at work, or the way you're going about game development in the community, is it all is very public, right? And I think often, maybe at least the old stereotype of a programmer is someone privately doing something. So if I would have, stereotypically conceived of a game development programmer, they are interacting with no one, privately working on a game, and then releasing it to the world, coming out of the darkness and sharing what they've created alone, right? So what kind of led you more into the public space with all these things?
I think I've always had some collaborative tendencies, so I
Okay.
think that was a large driver there.
Hmm.
But just acknowledging my own silos and just wanting to learn more and faster, I think is a large driver as
Hmm.
well. Because you kind of get stuck in your own space, and you very much limit yourself without that collaboration and mobbing in at play.
Nice, nice. Yeah. So yeah, more collaborative nature. And yeah, learning speed. I think someone who's more, natural tendencies are collaborative will gravitate that way. But I've also seen people whose tendencies are not collaborative. But once they've experienced the holy cow, I just learned something that would have taken me 10 hours grinding it out alone. You know, I think Chris gives me that experience about once a week or once a month at least, where we're like, I think it was recently, it wasn't game development, but we're like, we know there's a better way to do it. We've researched it. we haven't come up with it in a day, so we're just kind of doing this like slow feedback loop thing to, take code from some other place and inject it somewhere else so it can get used, just to, do some experimentation R&D. And then Chris pops into the mob and he's like, "Oh, do this, do that," and it's like takes it from 15 minutes to 5 seconds, and you're like, "Oh, holy cow! Learning in public is great." um, so I've seen people make the transition just like you talked about. The learning speed alone is addicting.
Yeah, I get pretty restless if I'm not learning at a steady rate. So,
Yeah, yeah, nice. Yeah, Chris, you got any other
Yeah.
questions for James?
Um, so yeah, you've encountered a lot of people trying to get into game development uh, right now, and you have a very interesting way of onboarding, and I've observed it myself. So like, is there any like advice you'd give to people that are looking to get started, and maybe with things with Godot or anything along those lines? I assume it involves mobbing in some way, but maybe
advice for
talk a
people
little
looking
bit more.
to get started in Godot.
Yeah, or in game jams or anything along those lines. Like,
Yeah, definitely. So I very much see people like, I want to make this game. It's going to be an MMO. It's going to be the biggest game ever made, right? I hear that very frequently. So the game jams are the perfect way to just do bite-sized learning, right? Because you get to just experiment. You get to try, especially in game dev, all these design patterns really, really fast. Like your code smells come out immediately, right? In
right.
game dev, which is really cool for learning. So I definitely recommend it for that. I totally lost my train of thought on that.
Nice. Yeah. Well, what I like about that though is, I mean, because that's honestly the kind of thing we try to do at work is,
Right.
um, I've even some people say a facet of Agile is just making your failures come out faster and more obviously than they were before. And so you can't hide from them. And so when you said like, oh, the we're making the code smells more apparent in your need for patterns faster, that appeals to me because the biggest pains I've felt with development in general is when those things are delayed and you're experiencing it when it's been, I don't know, fermenting for years
Yeah.
versus finding out about it right away.
Even if you're not looking to learn like games, like the space that game dev provides gives you a place to practice design patterns and
Mm.
refactor code smells like so fast, and it's such a fruitful learning platform that I try to bring it into work in some capacity, because there are people that obviously haven't been able to use a lot of the design patterns, whether it's factory pattern, adapter, there's a bunch of them. So if you are
Yeah.
looking to get into it, I would get involved with a community, or there's like a tutorial for Godot specifically. It's from Brackeys on YouTube that I'll share a link for, but
Nice.
it's like an hour, but it's so good.
Nice.
Yeah, and Brackeys used to was kind of like the top Unity YouTuber, and then he disappeared for
Yeah,
a
right.
number of years because he was kind of moving on, and then Godot brought him back to it. So it's a kind of an interesting story. So I see people joining your mobs, and I see them being streamed. Is it just open to anyone to join, or like how would they get involved with you on this sort of collaboration out in public, right?
So the Twitch experiments is relatively new. So I think it was maybe 6 months ago we started. Um, we've been toying with ways to get people more involved as far as like on voice with us. So the system I have it now is there's like, if you're in voice in general, and I've talked to you at least one other time before that, I that's like the waiting queue. We could pull you in and you'll just work with us on stream.
Okay, cool. Yeah, I guess it might be sign up to be on the Discord, which is like a chat environment with everybody there. Uh, Participate there, and then get invited to the public streams, possibly through engagement, right?
Yeah, I think it would take a lot of pride in just being easygoing and very approachable as far as any of that goes.
Yeah, right on.
Nice. I had a follow-up question. Sorry to
Go
squirrel
for it.
going back to another topic, Chris. In that you said these game jams, which I don't have great context on because I haven't done one. But my interpretation of coding jams in general is my stereotype understanding is that it would lead to the opposite of refactoring to patterns and refactoring in general, because I kind of feel like, oh, it's a short pressure cooker where you're just jamming out code to make the game work and you don't care about how clean the code is. So can you explain to me how the game jam leads directly to refactoring and design patterns? I'd love to hear that. Yeah.
No, that's a great question. So I think a lot of that's gonna the time box is a big factor there. So if it's 2 days, you're right, it's probably going to be pretty messy. But depending on the game, like if you need these reusable components in order to survive, like whether it's you have a enemy that's shooting bullets, right? They gotta have some reusable code there in some capacity. So it's definitely up to the engineer and how friendly they are with these patterns, but the need for them comes out pretty quick. So it's going to vary by game and the knowledge set, I guess.
A
But
lot of these game engines, because they're higher level software, like not only is it the programming language, so like Unity uses C Sharp and Godot uses its own kind of like a similar thing to Python, but not quite Python. And but all of these game engines all rely on some design patterns established by the engine. So it actually forces people, like you cannot write Unity code for the first time without being exposed to the component design pattern, because everything is a component in Unity and you can't really use it otherwise. And so there is that aspect of it where it's just kind of like you have no choice. You'll have to see it at least once, right? But I do think like when you're collaborating on that sort of stuff, you're like, well, so in mobbing, I imagine you're going to say like, wow, this is getting really complex and long and hard to reason about, all those things. And so um, you can certainly, yeah, like you
Gotcha.
said, longer game jam would probably lead to feeling the pain harder, faster because you're in this like really tight time box.
right,
Gotcha. Gotcha. No, that's fantastic. Yeah. So it almost seems like that. Yeah, Chris, you and I have talked about it quite a bit. We're seeking that learning moment as soon as possible, right?
Yeah.
Um, sometimes, sometimes it does take 10 years, like it did for me, to experience 10 years of pain to be like, there's another way. But if you can shorten that loop to be sooner, that's better. But without, hmm, it's like you want the most pain as soon as possible, as terrible
Right.
as that sounds. Because if it doesn't hurt enough, then you don't care, right?
Well,
Like,
and
yeah.
mobbing is a great way of accomplishing that quickly, right? Because if you're stuck by yourself, you might have a high tolerance for that. You might be like, okay, I'm going to spend 3 days on this. If you're stuck with two people, it's like, okay, we're like bashing our heads. We're going to go to lunch, come back, trying to figure out. If you're stuck with three people or four people or five people, then it's extraordinarily painful. Or if you're like moving extra slow, it's just amplified by the number of people with you.
Mm,
And so I find that mobbing, and then I guess if you add in the game jam aspect of it,
mm,
the pain becomes unbearable very quickly, right?
yeah.
And which is kind of it is a sort of desired effect, because once you
Mm.
amplify the pain, you look for a solution. But if it's just a nagging, a small headache that's going to diminish your performance over a course of multiple days, you might end up just living with it, knowing that the headache will eventually go away.
So basically, what I'm seeing here, James, is you've persuaded Chris that all he's going to do full time at work is just onboard people via game jams.
Yeah, there
And
you
that's how he's going to teach all the best
go.
practices. It's just writing games with people at work.
hey,
And
I
then
mean, we're
they,
trying to something similar. So
yeah, that's
Yeah,
Chris's
well, it's either that interpretation or put everybody in as much pain as possible as quickly as possible. So
Well,
that
it's funny. I remember one of the first katas you put me through, Chris. I remember taking you aside like halfway through and being like, Chris, don't you know everyone is really upset with you right now and they're hating life? How you're like like my experience of katas are these wonderful things where everybody loves it, and so yeah, the as long as you correctly attribute the pain to the right thing,
Right.
right? So
You got to expose it, find it, and then find a solution and inspect and adapt, right? So,
I think with the mobbers too, like if you got someone on there that's has seen like the painful like bullet creation, for example, like, oh, I know the factory pattern, like let's use that, like hopefully you can skip a lot of that pain just by having that SME on the call.
mm,
right. Yeah. I mean, that's just experienced mobbers versus like a group of people that are inexperienced trying.
Right.
There's different scenarios, right? So, putting in a bunch of interns into a mob together to then work on something new, like they're going to all struggle and they're going to experience a lot of pain and they're not going to have a lot of answers. And so that's a very different experience than having a gradient of skill levels. And then also, I've participated in mobs where it was all very experienced consultants and super senior developers, and that's a whole other experience because then it's almost like an ancient Greek philosophers like, well, if we put the code in this format, then these benefits will arise, and it becomes a very
yeah.
philosophy discussion, and almost the meaning of the code is completely lost. So uh, there are just these different modes of operation that occur in the different skill levels. So I find that ultra fascinating.
Nice, nice, nice.
I
Cool,
did
cool.
want to touch on one of the things that I think makes mobbing and Godot kind of unique.
Sure.
Because I don't know about you guys, but like we there's a lot of UI involved in Godot, and there's not as much at work, because typically, at least in my case, we're doing it through an IDE. So
Yeah.
there's not a lot of learning that goes into learning a software, right?
Hmm.
So through the mobbing in Godot, you have this complex like user interface, all these buttons, and there are a million different ways to do the same thing. So it's kind of a unique take on mobbing where you also get to learn a software tool and its various options. Do you guys see that at work at all, or what's your perspective there?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
Go
so I have a
ahead.
thought. So this is, I think, a key difference between the like same computer versus like multiple computers thing. Um, and so there's actually presenter mode in the JetBrains products and in presenter mode, it actually flashes the shortcuts that you've recently used up on the screen in big letters. And so when somebody is experienced with the JetBrains tools and they're doing a bunch of shortcuts and never touching the mouse sort of development, you see like, oh, what did you do just there? I saw that it flashed these things up, and you accomplished a whole bunch of stuff without interacting with the mouse very much. So I see that sort of thing happen. And then people can try and reproduce that, especially sharing that way. Um, I also think like mob testing is very much like that. Like, hey, we built something, now let's go and try it out and make sure it all works. And then you're interacting with the software that you've been working on, especially if there's multiple teams working on it and there's other menu items that haven't been created by your team. Um, so those are the sorts of things that I think pop out. But you're right. I think in Godot, it's like such a different paradigm, especially if it's a developer that's never done game development before. Then it's like you're just learning how it kind of takes the code out of the equation. So I'm not trying to prove myself with code. I'm just open to learning, right?
Mm,
Which I think is a problem because when you're trying to convince somebody very senior to mob for the first time, it's a challenge to get them to think about the learning benefits if they're only thinking about the code solution. And so if you're in Godot, then it's like, what's a scene? Why are there multiple scenes? Why are they stacked on top of each other? There are all these things that are nebulous and very much part of the domain of game development and can distract from the code, which is beneficial when teaching somebody to learn about these things for the first time.
Right, exactly. We've even used like attempted to learn through mobbing with like Illustrator. We
Okay.
want to learn how to
Yeah.
make some UI. Let's do it. And it was different, but it worked. I learned a lot about the tool.
nice, nice. Well, We are coming up on time. I will say that mobbing all the things, there are a lot of benefits from that, other than just code. And so, yeah, yes, and to that. But we are coming up on our time box. So, James, it's been wonderful having you on the show. Is there anything you'd like to share or plug before we close it out?
No, I think you guys will have some of my links in the description. So I just, I'm all about networking connections. So I'd be happy to see some new faces. I'll appreciate
Perfect,
it.
perfect. Yes, thank you so much for the show. I learned a ton from this. So thank you so much for this conversation. Feel quite inspired. And to our audience, if you feel equally inspired, please like, subscribe, please share this episode with others. Please get involved in the community, whether it's other parts of the mobbing community, or it's specifically game developments with James or others like him. It's a fun place to be. So yeah, come join us. And until next time, mob on everyone and have a good one. See ya. Thanks.
Thanks for joining us.